This is Carl Stone bringing you another in a series of composer-to-composer talks. These are radio discussions with composers in the 80s and 90s, originally broadcast on the air on my weekly series, Imaginary Landscape, which was heard on KPFK in Los Angeles. Except that this interview with Frank Zappa is from 1988 and was never actually broadcast on my program on KPFK. It's an interview that was commissioned by a Japanese magazine about a month before I went to Tokyo to live for 6 months on a grant from the Asian Cultural Council. And because we never actually expected this interview to be broadcast, we didn't really take care about the audio quality. So you'll hear glasses clinking, you'll hear some mic handling noise, a fair amount of language that would have been prohibited by the FCC back in the day, and also a fair amount of conversation taking place not squarely in front of the microphones. So audio quality aside, I still think it's a pretty interesting interview and worth broadcasting now. These broadcasts are being brought to you through the courtesy and with the tremendous cooperation of Dublab and dublab.com. So in our conversation, I quizzed Frank Zappa about his compositional methods, especially around the instrument that he had recently acquired and adopted as his signature compositional tool, the Synclavier. The Synclavier was a kind of proto-sampler synthesizer made in the 1980s, ruinously expensive. It anticipated by a couple of years the MIDI revolution that put these kind of tools, synthesizers and samplers, and even computer power in the hands of the masses. So we also talked about politics. We talked about the rise of the religious right and the dangers of a stacked Supreme Court. And these topics, of course, every bit as relevant today as they were 30 years ago when Frank Zappa and I spoke. So I've woven in some tracks from Zappa's album Jazz from Hell. The title track had just been given a Grammy a couple of weeks before we did this interview. And it's kind of fun to hear Frank Zappa's cynical remarks about getting that award. So let's listen then to this 1988 interview conducted with, in the home of, Frank Zappa. One of the things that they asked me to ask you about was a question that I'm interested in myself, which is your the differences in your approach to writing, say, orchestral or chamber music, as opposed to writing composition for the Synclavier, and maybe also comparing it to music that you might do for your band. Can you talk about sort of from the time inspiration hits, from the time the muse whispers in your ear, what goes on that's different in each case?
Well, in the case, the easiest thing to talk about is the band stuff, because you have to make certain assumptions about where the music is going to be performed and how it's going to be consumed, and that's pretty clear cut, because since I've been on the road for 25 years, I've got a huge database for that, and so everything that happens after the idea for the song occurs is filtered through that database. There is not the same kind of database available as far in my own mind for the consumer of a person, for the consumer of the Synclavier music or of the orchestral music. Mm-hmm. There's no clear-cut image in my mind of what kind of a person that is. So it's a different process in that the work for the Synclavier and the work for the chamber orchestra is not run through a filtering process that I would filter the work for the rock and roll band through. Is that
Yeah, in other words, the work for a rock band is written with a specific audience in mind.
Right.
The work for Synclavier, the orchestral music, is written for yourself.
You just do it. Yeah.
Uh-huh. And so I guess you can gauge the success of work written for an audience
based on whether or not they make any noise.
Right.
Not even if it sells. I mean, because it may be something that the audience really loves, but it won't sell because you can't get it into a store or you can't get it on the radio. So
it might be because of marketing problems or other economic problems that you can't sell it, but if you get a response,
you'll know right away from a live audience whether or not they got the point.
Okay. And so when you're doing music for yourself, how do you gauge whether or not it works?
By trying to remember at the point where you say it's done, what it was you thought you were going to do when you began, and comparing the results, the difference between what you intended to do and what you wound up with. it's a success if you wind up with as much as you intended to do or more. And if you wind up with less, then maybe it's not even done. So.
Well, usually, I mean, if you could speak more concretely, when you start a piece, what kind of things are you trying to do?
Well, it depends on the piece. Let's take the Synclavier stuff, for example. One day I might decide to do an experiment to find out how complex can a rhythmic framework be and still, let's call it the limits of detection experiment, where you would write interweaving melodic lines, and these things would be rhythmically justified to unusual tuplet groupings. One of the things I did one day was say, okay, all of my tuplets are going to be 110 in the space of this, and 111 in the space of that, and 79 in the space of something else, and just all odd, ridiculous tuplets that human beings can't play.
Right.
And how many of these things can you put together and still detect that there is something mathematical going on?
As a listener, detect that.
Yeah, using myself as the test case.
Yeah, but isn't that kind of a problem, because you are so intimately involved in structuring the piece, the architecture of it, you're putting it in, you're not a blank slate when you listen to it. So
oh yes, I am. Because if you're just typing it in, when you type it in, you're not listening to it, you're typing.
No, but you know basically what the form and the structure is. You already have kind of a leg up when you listen to it.
Well, I'm not trying to do this in terms of any kind of absolute research, which I would then turn over to a government agency to then be used against the public at large. I'm interested in, what do you hear?
Yeah.
Well, what a person, even given my rather biased position in the whole thing, what's the result, And it may take days or even weeks to build the experiment and then listen to it. And when you listen to it, you still might not be sure. And certain parts of the experiment would work fine and certain parts would not. And then what you do is you clip out those parts that don't work and stick the parts that do work, squeeze it together. Yeah. Then you listen to it again and you make an assessment as to whether or not it got better because you took out things that didn't work. And then sometimes you find that you need places in there that sort of don't work to set you up for the next part that does work. And, it's back and forth. And since there is since the world is not beating down my door to hear any of this stuff, I don't feel any time pressure to hurry up and deliver the results of the experiment. So I just keep working and working and working.
Did you turn to the Synclavier because you weren't able to get the performances that you wanted to have from human musicians?
Well, basically, yes. I think that if anybody who writes a tuplet that says 79 in the space of 37 and hands it to a clarinet player and expects accurate results is probably going to be in for a big disappointment.
So you were disappointed, but then someone might say that whether it's 79 in the space of 34 or 78 in the space of 34, what the heck difference does it make?
They could say that, but then again, maybe they couldn't hear the difference.
Oh. And so...
and they probably don't like serial music anyway.
Yeah, but neither do you.
Well, yes, I do like serial music. Yeah. I write serial music. It's just that I have a different, different parameters that I'm serializing, that's all.
What parameters of yours are proceduralized?
Oh, that's a long, long, long story. But just to make it short, there are serial procedures that I use in my work. Period.
I see. For example, is timbre is obviously serialized?
No.
It's not?
No.
So is that intuitive? You decide sort of, through some intuitive process?
That's very subjective. I can do a whole piece with a whole set of timbres in mind, and then on a day when I receive a new set of samples, or make a new set of samples here, I'll just arbitrarily decide to change the orchestration of the piece, and I wind up with something that's far more interesting than what I started off with, just because now I have a new timbral resource to deal with.
I see. So would you say that timbre is maybe the most subjective of the parameters that you're dealing with?
Generally? No, I try and keep it all subjective. The serialization that I use is a tool, not an ultimate end. That, in order for your piece to be right, that the serial pedigree has to be there. And basically, when it's done, it has to be something that I enjoy listening to.
So if you use some serial procedure and you don't enjoy the result, you feel free to make some modification or obviously edit in order to get something that you like.
Yeah. I mean, the serialization it's a means to an end, and the ideal end is a piece of music that's worth listening to. I mean, I don't know of too many people who can truly state that they enjoy listening to the numbers involved in the actual serial procedure. For me, the serial procedure is something that will help get you from one location to another.
How do
and provide a little bit of organization of a specific nature on another plane that can exist in the composition, but doesn't necessarily need to be something that sticks out that you listen to. It's there. It's helping to organize the piece, but it's not, the most triumphant aspect of doing a composition that your numbers add up at the end.
Right. Okay. Do you start by working with manuscript paper, little notes on staves, or do you work directly, starting with numbers, or do you just have a sound idea and start typing? How does it?
I can do it a lot of different ways. There have been times when you just start playing something on the keyboard with some timbre that you've selected and develop modules out of that, and you will start by editing the single line which began as the germ of the piece, and you'll tweak that up as much as you want and do things to that, and then you'll orchestrate around it, either by playing other parts in or typing in notes which are simultaneous occurrences with the notes in your original line to make harmonies occur at certain places, or rhythmic accents or whatever. Or you could have, I used to do a lot of sketching when I was on the road, carry manuscript paper in my briefcase, and just sketch down ideas when I was out there, and I've got piles of that stuff which I've never even listened to, and occasionally I'll go into that stuff and dig out some old sketch and type it in, and see whether that leads me anywhere.
You do a lot of the busy work of the typing yourself, don't you?
All of it.
You never thought about sort of subcontracting that out, or do you enjoy doing that? Or
well, some of it I enjoy and some of it I don't. I mean, I do have an assistant who's in there working right now, who his chores include maintaining backups of the entire database. He trims the samples. He is in the process now of preparing for retail sale my sample library. We're going to have that out hopefully by the end of the year. It's going to be called the Samples from Hell Library, available on optical disc, probably on Kennedy tape, and maybe a limited version of it on CD.
For CD, so it could be sampled into any system.
That's
in that
right.
case.
Yeah, but the primary customer is going to be New England Digital, and they'll put it out on an optical disc
for use by Synclavier players,
or anybody who uses optical disc.
I see. Yeah. And
this is a very complex job, and this is the kind of typing that I would not do, nor do I even feel qualified to do it. But the assistant's name is Todd Ivega, and he is very experienced to that.
Could you spell his name?
Yvega. Who may be known to people in Japan because he speaks Japanese. He's worked with a lot of Japanese. He's produced or co-produced a lot of Japanese acts, and so they may know Todd.
Okay, definitely put his name in. Well, anyway, it sounds like he's sort of dealing with the building components. He's not actually assisting you with the higher level structuring of the composition. You do.
No, he's got nothing to do with the composition. I mean, the closest he gets to working on the composition is if I've got a floppy that's crashed.
Yeah.
And there's, I don't type XPL, I don't type script, I don't do any programming, and he has all that knowledge. And so, like last night, we spent about 3 hours trying to retrieve some data from a crashed floppy. That's as close as any of the assistants that I've had working on the Synclavier ever get to the compositional process. If something fucks up, then they help me to fix it, but they don't write the music.
Right, or even type it in.
Well, in the case of typing it in, there are several ways to type it in. You can type it in on the music printing page, which I do. You can type it in on the G page, which I do. The G page shows you 3 columns on the screen, and in each column there are other little columns of information, like the name of the pitch, when it starts, when it ends, how loud it is, and what octave it's in. Mm-hmm. You can type on that page, and it doesn't look like music. It looks like a list.
Just a list of numbers.
It's a list of numbers.
Yeah.
I could type that. The other way to type something in is in their computer language called script, which I don't know all the codes for that. Mm-hmm. Todd can type that, and I have had assistants before who have entered compositions which were originally written on paper. They will type it in script and put it in that way because it's a lot faster if they do it than I do it. Mm-hmm. Some examples would be the entire Sinister Footwear ballet was typed in off the score mm-hmm. over many months in script into the Synclavier. I never could have done that.
Mm-hmm. That was adjudged to be easier than, say, entering it on a black and white keyboard off the score?
Oh, yes, far easier, far faster.
So
that's the kind of stuff, if one of my assistants working here is dealing with entering compositional data, if he's typing it in from something that I wrote on a piece of manuscript paper, but he's not, And the only exception to that was when I first bought the machine, I didn't know how to operate it. I just, knew that it was something I wanted to own, and I hired a guy named Steve DeFuria, who is probably pretty well known to people in the keyboard world because he's written a lot of columns and stuff.
Yeah.
Steve used to work here, and the way I got into typing on the Synclavier was my first composition on there was something called Ruth is Sleeping. Mm-hmm. It was a piece for keyboards. And to do this, I sat in a little chair behind Steve DeFuria, and I told him, change this pitch to this. I told him every thing, and he sat there and operated. It was the most grueling, horrible thing until one day he said, here, let me show you how to do this. And I sat down in the chair, and he showed me the basic commands to do it, and that was it. Mm-hmm. And, he had to beg to get back on the chair to run the machine because I just got hooked on it, and I've just been typing away ever since. And I spent months working on this piece, and I'm sure he went through hell having me whisper in his ear, move it to here, move it to there. Because at the time, I wasn't even thinking in terms of the name of the note plus the number of the octave. I really had to scratch my head to figure out where C5 was. Mm-hmm. And this mysterious C3. Now, what key really is that on there,
Right.
And so now you just get used to thinking a different way.
Yeah. You're also, you're a guitar player. You're not a keyboard player, you said. And so did you ever think about using, say, the Synclavier guitar interface?
I bought it, but I've never been able to make it work for me. I know other people have used it, and they think it's fabulous, but it hasn't worked right for me yet.
You think it's just a technical thing, a mechanical thing, or just you?
Well, since it works for other people, then it's obviously some deficiency in my playing. Mm-hmm. I'm probably just too slovenly to be a computer guitar player.
You think at some point you might, sort of put the nose to the grindstone and figure out really how to get it to happen the way you want?
Maybe.
Maybe. You started writing orchestral and chamber music at, an early stage in your career.
14.
Uh-huh. Before you really had a career.
I didn't have a career. Yeah. I never even expected to have a career. I just started writing music because I liked to write music. In fact, I started writing music because I liked the way it looked. Mm-hmm. I had art skill when I was a kid. And I just thought the music on paper looked fantastic. It was something that appealed to me graphically, and I started drawing it. And figured, well, this is easy, just get a C5 speedball pen and a bottle of Higgins India ink and some Passantino brand music paper at the local cowboy store, and look, whoopee, you're a composer now. All you had to do then was find somebody to play what it was that you wrote, because I hadn't the faintest idea what it sounded like.
Uh-huh. And did you pursue trying to round up people to play it around the time?
To the point that you can, in a town like Lancaster, California, or Claremont, California, down by San Diego, if you could find people who can read music, Even
Well, maybe
today, people who can read music in America are few and far between.
Yeah. I mean, do you ever look at those early scores and, I mean, think about them? Do they
Haunt me?
Yeah, or interest you?
Not really.
There is, by the way, a recording. I don't know if you know this. Absolutely ghastly quality, totally unlistenable, but it does exist.
Of Mount St. Mary's?
I think was it Mount St. Mary's or Pomona College? I think a performance of a piece of yours, perhaps at Pomona College. Might be Mount St. Mary's.
Well, if it was Pomona College, it wasn't a performance. It was probably a rehearsal. But there was a performance at Mount St. Mary's. It was probably the beginning of my career of bad experiences with orchestras, because in 1962, that spectacle cost me $300. $1962. And KPFK taped it.
Yeah. They did a god-awful job, if it's the tape I'm thinking of. I mean,
I'm sure that it's terrible. I mean, I have a second-generation copy of parts of their tape, and it's atrocious. Yeah. But then again, we weren't digital then. We were lucky to even have stereo, as a matter of fact.
Because you were interested in the visual aspect of scores, were you aware of like Hoppenstock Ramadi or any of the...
Oh, the weird tendencies for how to draw scores? Yeah, I'd seen some.
Had you ever thought about doing things like that, sort of non-standard notation?
I've done non-standard notation pieces, sure. I've done, developed my own notation system. I did all that, kind of juvenile experimentation with different ways to describe different things on paper. But, philosophically, I think that... it's probably useful to go through that just to see whether you can develop something that will actually work in a practical way. If you handed some sort of diagram to a musician and actually get what you want from the musician after you handed him the diagram, then your system is a success. But generally speaking, those kinds of things they tend to make matters more difficult rather than easier.
You were very interested in science when you were a little guy.
Yeah, still interested.
Oh, yeah? Do you pursue it at all?
Well, to the extent that I have a few people who are scientists that are friends, and I expect that when the pictures start coming in from Neptune, I'm going to get an invitation to JPL to get over there and watch that stuff come in.
Do you see any connection at all in your interest in science and what blossomed as your interest and career in music?
Well, one of the things that occurs to me is Varese also had an interest in science and mathematics and stuff like that. Mathematics really isn't my field, but physics I think is probably a little bit more interesting to me than math. And if you have an interest in physics and have an interest in what things really are, how things really work, why things work, and what could happen if you could change the way things work, then I think that has a direct relationship to how to compose. It gives you a different way to look at the composition process if you approach it from the standpoint of a physicist.
Do you think of composing itself as an act of investigation?
Sometimes. Sometimes it's just an act of, it's an expression of a sense of humor.
But when you try and find out how things work, when you make some discovery about the nature of things, how does that... Can you cite a concrete example of how that might help you in your composition?
Well, obviously every composer has to make choices. He has to put down on his piece of paper or whatever medium he's using, what it is that he thinks is aesthetically valid for what his project is. So how does one develop those building blocks to pursue a project so that the project that you pursue is, in the end, a result of your imagination, your personality, and your aesthetic viewpoint? My answer to that would be, the more that a person develops his or her own tools, own language, own stuff, tools and raw material, then And the more often that the composer uses his or her own tools and raw material, the more frequently the composer will be able to express something that is of that composer rather than of the world of composition. Now, it's pretty hard to escape the fact that if you're writing diatonic music, you're stuck with the black and white keys up and down the piano. And many people could say, they've all been used before. But that's part of the charm of it, because taking as an example in the world of television, in sitcoms, there's a term they use there. It's called the franchise. The franchise is that aspect of familiarity that's, the given. When you tune in a sitcom, you already know what the ground rules are. And so within those ground rules, you can experience the improvisational manipulations that take place every week with those characters. That's one of the good things about working in diatonic music, because there is a certain franchise there. And when a person perverts the franchise, the results can be truly spectacular, just because you are thwarting the normal expectation of the audience. So that's fun to do. It's a little bit more difficult to operate on that kind of a level with a personally developed harmonic system, a personally developed harmonic rhythm, and a personally developed choice of timbres, like, for example, a batch of invented timbres that you put on a synthesizer. If you're dealing with all new raw material and on all new tools, you're dealing in a franchise-free environment. And some people would say that's the ultimate freedom, but on the other hand, it is, in a way, a bar to communication. Because the existence of the franchise is something that helps you communicate the idea.
As a reference. As
a reference, yeah. It's just like you could be the greatest painter in the world, but without some kind of stretched canvas to put your stuff on, what are you doing?
Is that really the analogy, though? It seems to me that, Cubism, I have to think this through, but Cubism, in a sense, is what you're talking about, because it used referentially the real world, but distorted it.
Oh, I wouldn't choose that as a reference or as an analogy. No.
Well, how is then that?
You need a place to stand to say your speech. You know what I mean? You need something to. You also need a common language. You could be the most eloquent speaker in the world in Volapük, for example, but unless you're talking to somebody who also understands Volapük very well, you're a mumbling nuisance. So
you're saying that by using the diatonic language, which, it's not really a language, but it's just a convention, you have some shared...
You're at least talking the same language as the audience, or a certain portion of the audience. And, I have no qualms about mixing and matching tendencies in there. Like, things can have triadic harmony in them, and the next thing you know, there's no tonal center or whatever. It's just what seems to be appropriate at any given moment in the piece to tell the story that you're trying to tell. Now, that's not very fashionable, it's not very forward-looking, but who gives a fuck? I'm not in any competition with anybody to be Mr. Modern. And I think that the composers that are in competition to be Mr. Modern, and the schools that breed generations of guys who think that the only way they can be modern and up-to-date is write the ugliest shit that ever came down the pike, I think that it's anti-musical. I think that the whole idea of doing music is... there ought to be something conveyed. It doesn't even have to be emotional, but just something in there. Not just that you've done something that is massively ugly and incongruous. If that's your message, okay. There's a lot of people that have succeeded at that spectacularly in the last 30 or 40 years in modern music.
And you yourself have used ugliness as an aspect of your work, right?
Of course,
to make a point.
But when you're ugly on purpose, that's different than being ugly by proxy. You're ugly by proxy when your piece is ugly because you have a serial pedigree. See what I mean? That's like, if you intend to make the ugliest chord, then go for it. Please, let me hear that ugly chord. But if you think you've just written a masterpiece, and it's a masterpiece only because your numbers add up, I think you're in trouble.
So we each have to be the arbiter ourselves for what succeeds and what doesn't. I mean,
You either do that or you got to leave yourself to the tender mercies of the music critics who know even less.
right, or the audiences or whatever, such as they are.
Well, that's a big problem because the audience for contemporary music is in real bad shape. As far as I can detect, that's a desperate situation. Because they've been abused so often.
By bad music,
Of course, and like exploitive professors. The evil that has been done to music in the United States by guys with tenure and berets on. I mean, think about that. Mm-hmm. I'm just talking with Todd. He was telling me about some of the experiences when he was in school. What they taught him, how they taught him. I was astonished. I mean, this is a very smart guy. I'm amazed that he survived his music education.
In rock music, you don't have that same kind of problem.
You have other problems in rock music. The need to conform to the audio standard of top 40 radio or the limited spectrum of images which are permitted on MTV. This is a very constrictive medium to work in.
So it's just a different, something else to conform to. The pressure to conform to is different in pop music as opposed to
you just
contemporary classical music.
Yeah. But then on the other hand, it's easier to conform in pop music because most of the people who go into pop music have no intention of being creative. They only have intention of being rich. Mm-hmm. So it's no big conflict for them if an A&R man says, no, you're going to stick violins in here and we're going to sweeten this up and we'll get a few girls to go ooh ooh right in this place right here. Mm-hmm. Most guys say, okay, fine, we'll do it.
Right.
Nobody turns around and says, are you out of your fucking mind?
You ran into those kind of conflicts at the beginning of your career, battles with, and not just in production, but in marketing and everything else. True.
And I think that if I were getting a record contract today, I would probably be turned down because they don't want people who can argue with them. Mm-hmm. They don't want guys going in there who understand marketing because they don't want anybody challenging their authority.
Did you feel that you knew that kind of stuff before you went in, or you kind of learned, on your feet?
No, I just did it by instinct. It seemed to me that I knew that there was an audience someplace out there for what I did. And I made assumptions about what kind of magazines they read, mm-hmm. what radio they might listen to, what newspapers they might see, and I tried to steer all the advertising for what I was doing to those publications and to design, whenever possible, if there was going to be a radio spot to advertise an album, design the spot to be a contrast to the rest of what was going on the station so that it would draw attention to itself. Mm-hmm. Now, if you're working as an artist signed to a major record company and you allow them to handle the advertising for your product, which basically is the advertising for your personality,
right,
you're taking a big risk because these companies are not peopled by geniuses. These are just schlumps doing a job. And they don't give a fuck about your record because there's another record next week. You're one of them. Mm-hmm. You're just a job for them to do. And the worst things that ever came out in terms of advertising or radio spots regarding my product was always stuff that was done by the parent company mm-hmm. when they gave it to their in-house guys to do. It was mm-hmm. always bland. It was always stupid. It never sold a unit. And it was a waste of time and money. And it was always an embarrassment.
Nevertheless, how many record companies are willing to give up that kind of control, hand over artistic control over to their artists?
Well, at least Warner Brothers was smart enough to give it to Prince. Mm-hmm. Can you imagine what Prince's image would be like today if it really had all been left up to those guys out there in the valley? It's to their credit that they were smart enough to stay out of Prince's way.
I have to apologize because I don't follow the scene all that closely. I don't really know
what Prince sounds like.
Well, I know what he sounds like. I've heard his stuff on the radio, but I don't know that much about his image because I haven't been to his concerts and I don't.
Well, neither have I. But I mean, I think that you look at him. He is a creative guy. Whether you like his stuff or not, I think that compared to the rest of the stuff in the vicinity, Prince's stuff stands out because it's a vision. You can agree with the vision, you can disagree with the vision, but it looks like it's Prince. It's not Warner Brothers talking. And that's worth something. That's something that's worth protecting. It's something that's worth commending. And I hereby do that. I hereby commend Prince and Warner Brothers for working out whatever they worked out. You know, you can decide for yourself whether or not you like his music or like his personality or his image or anything else.
Yeah.
But I would say that the whole music scene would be better off if there were more Prince-like relationships between creative artists and the record company, where they would, you know, just stay out of the guy's way. And, you know, obviously the record company makes 10 times what the artist does, so why should they complain? If they're going to make the money, you know, they don't have to get involved in the rest of the stuff. Just help to deliver the goods.
Your album, Jazz from Hell, was recently awarded a Grammy.
Yeah,
And-
well, it wasn't the album, it was one song on the
Oh,
album
song.
called Jazz from Hell, and that's what's so ludicrous about it, because, you know, if the album had gotten a Grammy, I would probably feel different about it, but they gave the Grammy to a song which no one has ever heard.
What do you mean?
The song was never released as a single. It was never played on the radio. It is probably the most obscure cut on the album. It's the most atonal cut on the album. It's the weirdest thing on the record. I got a Grammy for this as the best instrumental composition of 1988. You figure it out. I'll bet nobody on the Grammy committee even listened to that fucking song.
How is it that it was nominated and selected?
Pure mystery to me. I had nothing whatsoever to do with it, and I still, you know, I think it's a crock of shit.
It strikes me that perhaps this is, I mean, just sheer cynicism, because, again, why would it have been selected? Is it because you're a major force in the industry, or?
I'm not a major force in the industry,
Well-
and here's the point. The statistics, I am told, work something like this. There are 55,000 songs released every year. So if there's 55,000 released, maybe there's 150,000 that are written that don't get recorded or released. Now the 55,000 that get released, maybe 100 get to be hits. Now the Grammy selection process is done by people who belong to NARAS. And in theory, the people who vote on this stuff have supposedly heard what it is, that all of it.
right.
Now that's impossible. It's impossible that everyone who casts a vote has heard everything that came out that year.
Right.
So it's a joke.
Nevertheless, that doesn't mean that no one could have heard and therefore could have selected Jazz from Hell. Yeah.
Given the rest of the things that won, if a person were to play the cut Jazz from Hell and put it up against anything else that won a Grammy in 1988, you tell me whether anybody who voted for that thing ever heard it. It says wrong in capital letters.
Well, I still got to ask the question: how did it happen?
I don't know. No idea. It's a mistake, and I'm sure they'll never do it again.
Oh, you think it's like a
They fucked up.
computer error?
Could be.
You went to the Grammy ceremony?
No, I was on tour. As a matter of fact, I offered to send my limousine driver from New York City, who was a real character, who had a nice acceptance speech that he had designed himself, that he wanted to use. They wouldn't let him go.
Well, aren't you entitled to nominate your acceptor?
Yeah.
It's not intolerant.
Yeah, well, it's a world of fakeness. You know, the reason they want you to go is because even if you don't win, the whole idea of all these award shows is they can put on television pictures of stars sitting in a chair, which brings the ratings up, which brings in the advertisers, and the whole idea of Grammys, Oscars, American Video Awards, and all that stuff is to sell advertising time. That's all it is. It's not about an award.
If it for some reason could not be broadcast on television, the whole thing would go out of business.
That's right.
Yeah.
No question.
Who else in the industry? You admire Prince, it seems, because he has a sort of singular personal vision, which he was empowered to deliver. Who else do you admire in pop music? Living or dead?
Well, I think that Jeff Beck is a fantastic guitar player. I think Alan Holdsworth is a fantastic guitar player, and I think Sting is probably a real conscientious guy. He's a nice guy, and I think that he's probably an exemplary guy.
Yeah, how about his music?
I don't know too much about it.
Uh-huh.
It's not my style.
Uh-huh.
I mean, I don't even know that much about Prince's music. I don't even own a Prince record.
Mm-hmm. But you don't do that much listening to music?
No.
In the so-called classical music world of composers, say, of the 20th century, well, let's say living composers, who would you cite as particularly respectable?
Well, I've said before that I like Takemitsu.
Mm-hmm.
And I like Penderecki. I think Velez is great. And
Any Americans?
no.
You think there's some reason for that?
Well, I'm not saying I'm completely familiar with everything that's been written in America in the last 30 or 40
No,
years.
but I'm sure you've been exposed to.
Well, most of what I've been exposed to didn't impress me, and it's not my style. It's just not something that strikes a chord within me. It just doesn't. I wouldn't spend an extra nanosecond of my time to listen to it. It's just my attitude.
Mm-hmm.
Because I get more enjoyment out of listening to the things that just as everybody else, I'm sure, you listen to the things that you really like. You want to have that listening time be a pleasurable experience, not an exercise in futility. And I've actually spent cash. I went out and bought records of contemporary music of every description that I could lay my hands on when I was a record collector.
Mm-hmm.
I've got a big collection of contemporary music, and I don't listen to it at all. Especially the most recent stuff. It leaves me absolutely cold and scratching my head. Let me give you one example of an American composition that I have enjoyed over the years and I've gone back and listened to. It's The Black Maskers by Roger Sessions.
Mm-hmm.
I've always liked that piece.
Why?
Just liked it.
I mean, can you say why? I mean,
harmonically, I liked it, and there's some, there's something about it that I liked.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know any of Sessions' other pieces.
Mm-hmm.
I've enjoyed music by Alan Hovhaness, but I seldom listen to it anymore. I mean, not that I've listened to the Black Maskers within the last 12 years either, but if I were going to give a nod to American composers, it would be to those two guys.
I see. Mm-hmm. How about someone like a Charles Ives?
The only pieces I like by Ives are Calcium Light Night, The Unanswered Question.
Mm-hmm.
The rest of it I don't enjoy. Oh, and then there's some theater pieces that were recorded by the Yale Chamber Orchestra.
Theater pieces?
Yeah.
How about someone like Conlon Nancarrow, who, in some respects, I mean...
It's hard to think of him as an American composer, but I guess he is.
Well, just as a composer, then.
Yeah, I like Conlon Nancarrow, yeah.
Because I was going to say, this strikes me as being some similarity in his approach and yours.
Yeah, I mean, I think he's a good guy. And I used to like Harry Parch in Controlled Doses. I thought that this stuff went on and on and on too long, but certain sections in the music on record I thought were really very brilliant.
The editors asked me to ask you about how you got interested in politics to the degree that you participated in last year's presidential election by sort of setting your sights on Pat Robertson.
Well, who else is going to do it? See anybody else going after Pat Robertson? Americans were afraid to tackle that motherfucker. And who is he? He's just a scammer. He's just a guy who's plugged into the Reagan administration. He bought his way to success, and he's a fraud. There, I've said it, and I'm glad. He's another one of those crooks for Jesus, and nobody would touch him.
You think there was actual intimidation involved?
I think that people are afraid to stick their neck out. I mean, there's the reason why he didn't get elected is I think that people are a lot smarter than you give him credit for. And even though he did have a rabid constituency, small but rabid, the average American, even the average Christian American, looked at Pat Robertson and smelled a rat. Mm-hmm. And even though they might not want to go on record and say, this guy, there's something real wrong here, just because it would be inconvenient for them in their workplace or in their community or something to take exception to a Christian gentleman such as this. Mm-hmm. I didn't feel any reason why I shouldn't say what was on my mind. And I think a lot of people whether they agreed openly or not, certainly agreed with the position I took on who he was, what he was trying to do, and whether or not the guy was fit to hold a public office.
You also took a strong, active, visible stand against labeling. I mean, something that relates to the industry that you're involved in.
Well, I can't say that I'm totally enthusiastic about the industry that I'm involved in. I mean, it's as corrupt as any other industry. But then on the other hand, I do think that if you're going to have a so-called democracy, you ought to be able to have some things to rely on in terms of rules. And the best one that I can find is the First Amendment. And that's always worth fighting for.
You must be viewing with alarm the turn of events. It's not really a turn of events, but recent developments with the U.S. Supreme Court.
Well, all you got to do is look back over the last 10 years and look at the interviews. I've been talking about that, warning people the damage that could be done if Reagan managed to restack the Supreme Court. These guys have a lifetime tenure. You're looking at 50 years of this shit now. It's a big danger. Most people, up until recently, people didn't even think about the Supreme Court. Unless you're in the law business, the Supreme Court, what's that? Who cares? Who are these guys? They had a very low profile. But this, abortion business that just popped up is ludicrous.
What's especially ludicrous to me is the idea that this is somehow not an activist court.
Absolutely. It's the myth that, the true conservative position is you got a constitution, you leave it alone. You don't fuck around with it. A liberal judge is supposed to be a judge that is always modifying.
Right.
Well, what the fuck do you think these guys are doing?
It's all very convenient, if it suits their
That's right.
political goals. Then.
Yeah, but see, on the other hand, you have a nasty situation in the lower courts, which is this demon called case law.
Speak about that, please.
Well, here's the demon of case law. You have a case. You go to court, and your case is heard by a jury of your peers. Ha, ha, ha. How can a person actually have a jury of their peers? The jury pool is, where do you get these people from? Even if your peers are available, each lawyer on either side has the right to challenge the juror sitting in the box. And what he's trying to do is psychologically stack the jury box with people who are going to give him a favorable decision. This is not a jury of peers. This is a jury of stacked clones. At the end of the trial, the stacked clones deliver a verdict. This verdict has an impact on all similar cases throughout the country. That's the demon of case law. Now, if you start off with a body of law which is badly written and randomly enforced, and then try the law with stacked clones who then generate case law, which affects the next case that comes in, you have a cancer of the legal system in this country, which is unbelievable. We have people in the United States right now who can't afford shoes, clothes, or housing. How are they going to afford lawyer number one, let alone the appeals and the rest of the stuff in order to get justice? The only people who can get what they think is justice are the ones who can buy the shit. Now, this is a big problem. And when you don't have to be too smart to look around you to see that there is not much in the way of justice that transpires in U.S. courts. This reduces confidence in the law. And then you combine this with the activities of the lawyers themselves, many of them drug-infested buffoons who are in there just to make a buck. These guys, after they've practiced law, go on to living in the world of politics where they write law. And the law that they write is not designed to create justice, it's designed to create jobs for other lawyers. So you have a body of law which is incomprehensible, varies from state to state. At the federal level, it's contradictory. It's badly enforced. And even if they enforced everything, we'd all be in jail. Because somewhere, someplace, there is a law you're breaking right now from wearing that fucking shirt or having that thing sitting on your lap or whatever it is. You don't know. That's how desperate the situation actually is.
So what recourse do we have?
Well, one way is to declare every home in the United States a potential prison, so that when they do finally arrest us all for doing what we were doing, which is against the law, we can just stay home.
Well, it sort of gives a whole new meaning to the term house arrest.
That's right. What you have to do is, since ultimately there is a judgment, a single man's judgment or a panel judgment involved in the final appeal upon the appeal upon the appeal.
Right.
Okay? Now, this puts an awful lot of power in the hands of the guys in the Supreme Court. This is, like life and death power.
Yeah.
Economic life and death power, real life and death power, everything. It sticks it there. Now, if the Supreme Court is a polluted institution, which I believe it is right now, it is not fair, it's not biased, it's not unbiased, it is not even-handed. It is basically an ideological tool of something that turns out to be quite an evil organization. The Republican Party is turning out to be its own evil empire. Every scandal reveals the depth of the depravity there. And they've got a stranglehold on the law. I think it's time for some serious thought about impeachment of Supreme Court justices.
Is there a chance you might actually make a public call, in an activist way,
I don't know what
done for causes in the past?
Well, I don't know what's the right venue to do that. I mean, these are things that I think about every time I see stuff on television. Now, if I had the chance, what tools would you use to fix it? Not even how do you fix it, but what tools would you use? Because the fixing is actually a long, complicated job.
Right.
And then
it could also demonically, it could make matters worse.
Ask yourself, how much worse could they be?
Famous last words.
I'll take the fucking chance. I'll take the chance that what I propose would make things better rather than worse. I'm arrogant enough to say that I think that my proposals would make things better. No, you can say I'm crazy, and I'll take that fucking risk. But I think that we have a bad situation here, and it needs to be fixed.
I just mean you could impeach any one of those guys and come up with someone who's even more evil. You
could, sure. So that's the possibility. Yeah. But I think that I recommend an investigation of the Republican Party as a whole. I mean, what sort of institution is this? This is, it's not an American kind of an organization. Another thought occurred to me this afternoon about church and state type situation, how Christian fundamentalism interfaces with the concept of democracy. And here's the result of this little musing. Fundamentalist Christians believe they are the chosen people and they are going to heaven. That means they're the few and everybody else goes to hell. In democracy, the majority rules. The majority is going to hell. Now, if you're a fundamentalist Christian, wouldn't it rub you the wrong way if a bunch of people who are going to hell are telling you how to live your life? We've got a built-in problem here, which seems to be very intractable.
Well, yeah, that's why they are.
That's right.
In the core anti-democratic.
That's right. Yeah. So, in that case, if you have a group of people who are against democracy on a religious basis, wouldn't you logically be able to say that these people are a threat to democracy and should be dealt with as if it were a foreign organism invading the fabric of American life, seeking to overthrow our American values? I think it's worth saying it that way. If you don't want to have democracy, then what the fuck are you? You're worse than a communist. The communists want it now. The people who don't want it are the born-again Christians. So what are we going to do about these guys? Here's another statistic that was just released yesterday. Did you know that the teenage suicide rate has peaked in 1977 and has been going down ever since?
No, I didn't know that, actually. That's just sort of well concealed.
That's right. It was a government statistic that was announced yesterday. Okay? The reason it was announced is because they're saying that elderly suicide has been rising. Now, figure it out. It peaks in 77 and it's going down. In 1985, 86, 87, we have the PMRC screaming about teenage suicide. It's going up, it's going up, it's going up. Well, they're lying. Now, here's the corollary. In 1977, the important form of music was disco. People going around saying, staying alive, all right? Disco kills more people than heavy metal. And the reason is, in 77, you could want to die because you didn't look good in John Travolta's white suit. Today, you can live longer because any schmoo can wear a fucking leather thing on his arm with studs on it. You know? So there's a statistic worth citing.
And well, then it could even be argued that satanic lyrics have are socially beneficial.
Well, they've certainly reduced the suicide rate according to government statistics. Mm-hmm. More people died during the season when guys in high voices were saying, "Staying alive," and guys in white suits were dancing around throwing girls around the floor. Now that kills.
Well, one thing in closing that I'm requested to ask you is about future plans, touring plans.
None.
None whatsoever.
Nope.
Are you through with live music now?
It's something I can't afford to do. So if I find a way to afford to do it, then I'll do it. Right now, I cannot afford to do it.
What are the costs of, you're talking about hiring a band, going out with your PA, those kind of hard costs?
Hard actual dollar costs. What do you think it costs to hire a 12-piece band, rehearse them for 4 months, rent the rehearsal space that they go into, hire the crew that is the life support system for them, rent the lights, rent the PA, do all that stuff, then buy the airplane tickets and the hotel rooms to put them on the road? What kind of capitalization do you think that is?
I shudder to think, but a lot of people do that. A lot of groups go out. What's the difference in your situation?
A lot of groups that do that go out with a beer company behind them or a Coca-Cola company behind them or somebody else behind them. I've got no corporate sponsorship. I have to pay that all myself and always have. But the thing is, I've never sought corporate sponsorship. The fact is that when I began touring, the cost of touring were lower. You could have the difference between what you made and what it cost you to do it.
Yeah.
There was a chance that at the end of the tour, you had money in the bank. Mm-hmm. Okay? I can't even go out now and break even. I told you before, 88. I lost $400,000. I can't afford to do that. Mm-hmm. You know anybody in his right mind that wants to tour and spend, it was 8 months, 4 months rehearsal, 4 months on the road of hard work. Mm-hmm. Would you like to come back with a net loss of $400,000? If you knew that what was going to happen, would you in life go out there?
It's not what I would call positive reinforcement, no.
That's right. Mm-hmm. So that's the fact.
Mm-hmm. Do you miss that?
No. The fact is, you can't. What do you mean go out? What are you going to do? It costs money to put the band together.
Well, I said take the money out altogether. Let's say that
you can't take the money out. It's about money. You have to go on stage with a band, okay? Yeah. And the band must be good. How do they get good? They have to rehearse. Mm-hmm. Will they volunteer to rehearse? No fucking way. Mm-hmm. You hire good musicians. What do you think they want? They want good money. Mm-hmm. You have to pay them to go there and learn the music, okay? It takes months to do that.
My question was just...
You can't even do one show.
Right.
If you spent the money to put the band together, you must do many. That's right.
But all I'm asking is... Given the economics, given the fact that you can't go out, do you miss that? Do you miss performing live?
No.
Mm-hmm. I guess Japanese audience shouldn't be expecting us.
I would not be urging them to hold their breath.
Okay. You don't. Well, that is basically all I have. Is there anything you want to say for your readers in Japan?
How come in kanji characters there is a word for radio? And the literal translation is no lines. And one of the characters has the component that says white water. Like that.
It's poetic.
It's very odd. I was sitting I'm riding in Tokyo in a radio cab, and I noticed that, there's a sign on the window, and it's in kanji characters. And I said, what does it say? It says radio cab. I said, how is there a kanji character for radio? Mm-hmm. No answer. Mm-hmm. This is your kanji quiz, folks. Please tell me, where do we get a kanji character for radio?
Okay, we'll get to work on that right away.
Okay.
Thanks a lot.
Yep.
I wish I had known then what I know now, having lived in Japan for the past 18 years or so. Those kanji characters that Zappa saw in that taxi would be translated as musen, or wireless. And this denoted the fact that the taxi had a kind of two-way communication with home base via CB radio. So that mystery is solved. The kanji that Frank Zappa saw wasn't for radio, it was for wireless. For the past 2 hours, we've heard a program dedicated to the composer Frank Zappa, mainly an interview I conducted at his home in the summer of 1988. This interview was intended for publication in a Japanese magazine and not for broadcast, so apologies for the sometimes not so great audio quality in the conversation. But still, I hope you enjoyed the program. These broadcasts are, for the most part, my 1980s and 90s imaginary landscape radio interviews. They're being presented thanks to Dublab. Thank you, Dublab, for making it happen. And special thanks to Samuel Lamontagne, J.R., and Alejandro Cohen for all of their help. Many thanks to you for listening as well. This is Carl Stone. I hope you enjoyed this program.